At 35,000 feet over Germany, a B-17 is on its way back for a bomb run. Radio operator Nelson King sees the tail gunner collapse a few feet away from him, gasping before going limp. An oxygen hose hangs useless over his shoulder, rimmed white with ice. The formation can't descend. German fighters are waiting below for stragglers. Whatever's wrong has to be fixed from inside the aircraft. He approaches the crumpled man and checks his gear. The oxygen coupling is frozen solid. To fix it, King will have to remove his gloves and work the fitting with his bare hands in 60 below air. At this altitude, frostbite happens almost immediately. The gunner has minutes left. King has seconds to choose. By late 1943, daylight bombing dominated aerial operations over Western Europe, and the B-17 Flying Fortress was at the center of it all. With casualties all around the board, it wasn't uncommon to see dozens of these bombers lining up inside English airfields, being awakened before the sun. Engines coughed and caught on wet concrete, and the sound carried across the hard stands long before anyone could see much beyond the perimeter light. Ground crews moved down the line one bomber at a time. They topped off fuel, wrestled bombs into place, and loaded the guns, then went over the same panels and connections they always worried about. Most of it was routine, until it wasn't. A drip that seemed minor on the ground could turn into a serious problem once the engines were running, and the aircraft was hours from home. Airmen climbed aboard, hauling helmets and parachutes. They stowed their oxygen masks where they could be grabbed without searching. Some carried small tins of food, knowing the sortie could last most of the day with little room to move. Each B-17 carried 10 men spread across fixed stations, and the flight only worked if every position held. By the time they climbed aboard, the mission board was already posted. Germany again. Heavy bombers flew from England into German airspace to hit what kept the Reich fighting: aircraft factories, engine plants, oil facilities, rail yards, or ports. They were aiming for precision, which demanded steady flight over the target, while the bombardier lined up the drop. The 8th Air Force believed mass could force a path through, so hundreds of bombers flew in tight box formations with overlapping guns. Over Germany, flak bursts waited up where the bombers had to fly, thickest around the big targets. The shrapnel didn't need a direct hit to do damage. On its own, it was strong enough to rip through thin skin, slice a cable, or punch an oxygen line. If that weren't enough, there was also the issue of the enemy fighters waiting for the survivors. They tended to come in from the edges and commit to head-on attacks, especially on the longer legs, where the escorts still couldn't stick with the bombers for the entire route. Every takeoff was a risk, and every return depended on narrow margins. Only if enough engines were still turning, enough systems were still working, and enough men were still conscious would they be able to bring the bomber home. Nelson King went to war the way most bomber crewmen did, without a reputation or a story attached to his name. He was barely old enough to vote, but he was already trusted with a radio, a gun, and 9 other lives. King served as a radio operator and as a gunner. His station sat near the middle of the aircraft, surrounded by equipment, radio sets, and control boxes. In front of him, there were intercom wiring, spare cords, charts, and the antenna system that tied the bomber into the traffic around it. Before the English coast even fell behind, radio traffic was already moving, bringing with it call signs, headings, time checks, and course changes. Short transmissions had to be copied cleanly and passed forward without getting twisted. He had to be wary, as the signal was never guaranteed. Static could wipe out half a sentence, and engine noise and vibration could bury the rest. In a tight formation, missed calls and garbled instructions could throw timing off in a hurry. Once the stream crossed into hostile airspace, the radio remained active, relaying reports from other crews and instructions from the system. On the other hand, the aircraft's intercom carried updates from around the plane, especially what gunners were seeing, what was changing outside, and what looked wrong. King took in a running list of problems and threats, such as fighters building in the distance, flak ahead, smoke off a wing, a door that wouldn't seal, or a gun starting to jam. and passed the important information along while the aircraft shook and the cold stiffened his fingers. When the radio cut out or the intercom failed, the crew lost their sense of the plan. Calls came late, turns came late, and the formation started to loosen, which kept them exposed longer than they should have. The job, however, could switch without warning. When fighters showed up, King stopped acting as the relay. He yanked off the headset, moved to his gun position, and started watching for attackers as the first bursts of fire went out and flak hit close enough to jolt the aircraft. Fighters often looked for a bomber's blind spot and aimed for engines, cockpit glass, or any place that could end the fight. That was the daily rhythm for men like King. And for a while, he was just one of many men holding a station and doing necessary work, flight after flight. Thorpe Abbotts was where the missions began, and where the 100th Bomb Group lived between flights. It was a small hamlet in Suffolk, about 90 miles north of London, that was turned into a working airbase that housed thousands of Allied airmen and support staff. In 1943, the group kept getting assigned to hard, deep targets and kept coming back short on aircraft and crews. This inspired their nickname of the Bloody 100th, which reflected the mounting losses they'd been facing lately. Monday, November 29, 1943, started with the standard 2:30 a.m. wake-up call at Thorpe Abbotts. It was their 9th mission, and the briefing sent them to Bremen, a port city with factories and rail yards that kept German production moving, with 4,800 pounds of bombs loaded in the bay. Among the aircraft in that stream was a B-17 that didn't even have a nose name yet. Lieutenant Frank Loro flew as pilot, with Joe Griesemer beside him. Murray Schrier rode in the ball turret. Dewey Thompson manned the top turret. Bill Heathman covered the waist gun. And in the radio room, headset on, gun within reach, was Sergeant Nelson King. Engines warmed, the line began to move, and the bombers taxied out. The formation climbed in wide circles until it locked into a box and headed across the water. Over Bremen, the bomb run went smoothly, which some described as a milk run. After the mission, the formation turned for home and climbed to around 35,000 feet, trying to get on top of the clouds and make the return leg harder for German fighters to pick apart. It should have been the start of the quiet part of the flight. Instead, that's when everything went wrong. At that altitude, staying conscious depended on oxygen equipment. Their masks stayed sealed to their faces as regulators fed oxygen through hoses and outlets that ran the length of the fuselage. It all started in the ball turret. Sergeant Murray Schrier was alone in a steel sphere under the belly of the B-17, staring at the sky the moment the climb ended. Above the canopy, it stopped looking blue and turned black. At that altitude, he expected fewer attacks, but his position came with its own problems. He couldn't wear a parachute in the turret. Complicating issues, at 5'9", he was too tall to keep his boots on in that space, so he flew with heavy socks stacked on his feet, trying to keep them warm. Suddenly, he started having trouble breathing. Without him noticing, the temperature fell to around 60 below zero. The ball turret wasn't connected to the bomber's fixed oxygen lines, so Schrier relied on portable oxygen bottles. Oxygen carried moisture, and in that kind of cold, the moisture froze. On earlier flights, the line might turn to icy slush, and a crewman could squeeze the tubing with his hands to keep it flowing. This time, it froze hard. Schrier felt it right away. The flow changed. His breaths got thin and uneven. He instinctively knew something was failing. He keyed the intercom and told Lieutenant Frank Loro he was getting out of the turret and why. Loro could hear in his voice how bad it was. Schrier decided to crawl to the radio room, where an extra mask was kept. His plan was to plug into the aircraft's main oxygen system to save himself. Before he moved, he called Nelson King and told him to have a mask at the ready. Leaving the ball turret took time and effort. Schrier unplugged what he could, forced himself out through the tight opening, and started crawling through the fuselage. He reached the radio room door and grabbed the knob. Then everything went blank. He passed out before he could even get inside. King came out of the radio room immediately. With help from the right waist gunner, Bill Heathman, he dragged Schrier to an oxygen outlet and tried to get him on the bomber's fixed lines. In the scramble, King and Heathman switched to portable bottles themselves, not realizing that the bottles had caused the problem. King tried to fit an extra mask onto Schrier's face and helmet, but it was the wrong type. The fittings didn't line up with the helmet, and the heavy gloves he was wearing made his movements worse. King tried to hook it in place anyway, forcing stiff rubber against frozen metal, but it wouldn't budge. Since every second mattered, and could be the difference between Schrier getting air back or going unconscious for good, King decided that the only option was to tie it on. For that, King stripped off layers of his own gloves so his fingers could work. The cold hit him immediately. He felt his skin raw and biting, but he kept moving, looping the straps around Schrier's helmet and pulling them tight enough to seal. While he worked, Bill Heathman began to fail beside him. Heathman's portable bottle had iced over too. He tried to crawl back toward his waist gun, helped by the other waist gunner, Gerald Will, who had tied into one of the same bottles and was now struggling to breathe himself. Will started fading. Heathman managed to call for help before he collapsed. Then King's own bottle clogged while he stayed on Schrier. Just as he finished tying the mask down, oxygen finally began flowing through the main line into Schrier's face. At the same moment, King toppled forward and collapsed onto him. 4 men in the rear of the aircraft were now out of action. Up front, Loro knew something was wrong. He wasn't getting responses from the back of the plane, so he sent co-pilot Joe Griesemar and bombardier Walt Green aft to find out what had happened. At the same time, he noticed the number 2 engine starting to act up. German FW-190s were now sliding toward the edge of the formation. If the fighters had known what was happening inside that B-17, it would have been an easy victory. They made one pass, but navigator Emery Horvath and top turret gunner Dewey Thompson poured out enough fire to keep them from pressing the attack. In the radio compartment, Griesemar went to work. He got oxygen flowing to Schrier first, then to King, while Green helped Will and Heathman. Schrier came around before the others. Griesemar hauled him forward and put him into the co-pilot's seat. Schrier was shaking uncontrollably. His electrically heated suit wasn't working, and the cold had gone deep. He tried to talk, but his jaw wouldn't cooperate. His whole body rattled. Then he realized he couldn't see. The moisture around his eyes had also frozen solid. Up front, Loro eased the nose down and began a careful descent, trading altitude for warmer air while keeping the bomber tucked in as close to the formation as he could. King's hands had been bare in -60-degree air for nearly 20 minutes. More than simply frostbitten, they were frozen solid. When Griesemar finally turned to him, he shoved King's hands under his arms, trying to force heat back into them, but there was no response. When King came around, confused and shaking, instinct took over. He began slamming his hands against the aluminum, trying to drive feeling back into them. They were swollen and misshapen, and as he struck the metal, bits of frozen flesh flaked off like ice. On the ground, ambulances were already standing by. As the bomber rolled to a stop, doctors moved in immediately. Schrier was examined, but he recovered quickly enough to be back on the flight line in time for the next mission. Moisture around his eyes had frozen, and if he'd stayed in that cold for longer, the damage would have been permanent. Heathman and Will came around after brief blackouts. They were shaken but alive. King, for his part, had to stay behind. The cold exposure was over, but the damage in his hands kept creeping forward. Loro later said, quote, "Frostbite was no word for what happened to his hands. One of the flight surgeons looked at them, and I looked at the doc, and what he must have been thinking wasn't pretty." Over time, King lost all his fingers and thumbs. Back at Thorpe Abbott's, the crew picked a name for their B-17 and went looking for paint. They brushed it onto the nose in block letters, Nelson King. On the paperwork, the aircraft remained a serial number, but out on the line, the name was the first thing seen. Ground crew walked past it on the way to the next ship. Airmen from other crews glanced over as they climbed into their own planes. They would know it belonged to a man who kept a crewmate alive when the oxygen failed at altitude. after that, the aircraft became a moving tribute, rolling to the runway with that name in plain sight, taking it across the channel and carrying it into enemy airspace again and again. The Army followed suit, awarding King the Silver Star, a citation that simply formalized what everyone on that crew already understood. Then the schedules took over again. As soon as the ship was patched up, the armorers hung new bombs, and the next mission number went on the board. Several months later, on March 6, 1944, the crew of Nelson King noticed the route on the target map ran farther than most crews had ever been asked to fly. The red tape pushed past the usual turning points and kept going until it reached Berlin. The mission was a straight shot at the capital, and nobody pretended it would be easy. Berlin was ringed with defenses, and they expected fighters to rise in numbers. The planners also knew they were going to lose planes on a run like that, but the idea of pulling the Luftwaffe up into the air and wearing it down over time would be worth the sacrifice. The route put them over heavy industrial targets, such as the Bosch Works, the ball bearing plant at Erkner, and a Daimler-Benz engine factory. Ball bearings were tiny, but they were buried inside almost anything with moving parts. If that supply got disrupted, machines started failing, and production slowed down, sometimes for reasons that were hard to fix quickly. Aircraft engines mattered for a simpler reason. Engines meant fighters. Every power plant that rolled off a line was another aircraft that could climb up on the next mission. And plants like Bosch also supplied key parts for repairs, so damaged weapons and planes could be put back into service instead of being written off. The losses began before they were even clear of England. A B-24 from another group disappeared into the mist right after takeoff, clipped a tree, and went up in flames. The crew behind it still had to go. Wheels up, climb out, passing the burning wreck as they held formation and kept to the timetable. Once over the channel, gunners fired short test bursts to check their weapons. One aircraft turned back when a spent cartridge case from a bomber above punched through its nose. Others dropped out over the North Sea with mechanical trouble. By the time the force reached altitude, dozens were already gone. The bombers that remained in the mission were locked into box formations. Each box held 21 B-17s, arranged in a tilted V, tight enough that their guns overlapped, and a ship that drifted out of position could be singled out fast. Boxes were grouped into wings, and wings into divisions, until the sky was filled with hundreds of aircraft. Nearly 1,500 Allied bombers and fighters were in the air that day. Inside the formation, Nelson King flew with Combat Wing 13B. Berlin was still hours away, and everyone aboard knew the hardest part was the long, exposed flight through defended airspace to reach it. And even harder still, the even longer way home if anything went wrong. Laura was back in the left seat of Nelson King, but the right seat wasn't the familiar face it should have been. Captain Jack Swartout, an experienced lead pilot with a fighter background, rode beside him. That move shot the regular co-pilot, Joe Griesemar, out of the cockpit and back into the tail gun. He hadn't been trained for it, and it put him in the one station where attacks came fast and close, with almost no warning. Over the North Sea, the bomber stream started to pull apart. The gap between the leading wings and the middle of the division kept widening, first by 12 miles, then 20. In addition, the lead bomber had radar problems, and the group had drifted south of the planned route. With a 45-mile-per-hour wind pushing them, the 1st Division was sliding off course at about a mile every 2 minutes. The navigator had already corrected the 3rd Bomb Division's route to account for the wind. Radio silence meant there was no easy way to compare notes. From his seat, it looked like the lead group was simply pulling ahead, not peeling off onto a different track altogether. As a result, Nelson King had to take over and lead the entire remaining bomber force. Escort cover was thin, just a handful of P-47s nearby, while the main fighter protection stayed with the larger mass. German tracking stations saw the break between the groups almost right away. On their radar screens, it stood out as a clean gap. They took it for what it was, an opening, and started pushing fighters toward the separated bombers before the escorts could slide back over them. While a B-17 could throw a wall of fire to the rear, the nose was a different story. A short burst into the front end could end a bomber quickly. and the Germans were aware of this. They came in with Me-109s and FW-190s, diving and charging head-on in quick waves, crossing the formation so fast that gunners struggled to get a steady lead. In the tail, Griesemar fought on instinct alone. According to him, quote, "The guns were so hot, they continued to fire after I let off the trigger. The heat from the guns was causing the bullets to go off on their own." The first wave of Luftwaffe attacks hit fast and hard. In less than a minute, 10 B-17s went down almost at once. In the high squadron of Wing 13B, 6 of the 9 aircraft were trailing flames. According to Loro, they, quote, "came down from very high and on our right at tremendous speed. 5 abreast, a dozen deep, all of them focused on our group." The gunners fired until the sky filled with tracers, but the fighters kept coming. Wave after wave peeled off and slammed into 1 or 2 bombers at a time, ripping holes and moving on before the guns could settle. Just behind that rush, a single German fighter came straight at Nelson King as it fought through the swarm. It fired, then pulled up too late. The wing of a Messerschmitt Me-109 ripped through the big square D on the bomber's tail fin, tearing away part of the vertical fin and rudder. In the tail section, Lieutenant Joe Griesemar was knocked unconscious and something struck above him. He came to on his back with nothing but sky in his view, and for a split second thought he was falling. Then he realized he was still inside the bomber, which was still flying. He hauled himself back into position and went back to his guns, not yet knowing that a fighter had almost torn the ship in two. Loro and Swartout both fought the controls, but the airplane no longer wanted to fly clean. It slowed, vibration building through the frame, so they fell out of formation. Alone, Nelson King wouldn't make it home. Swartout dropped the bombs to lighten the ship and kept the nose pointed toward Berlin, hoping to stay near the stream long enough to survive. That was when the next attack came. An Me-109 appeared without warning and fired a burst of 20mm cannon shells. One detonated inside the right side of the cockpit, shredding the instrument panel, knocking out the hydraulics and cutting the onboard radio. A fire started at once. Swartout yelled that he'd been hit, sure he was wounded, before he realized he was soaked in hot hydraulic fluid from his ruptured lines. Even so, the shell slammed into his chest, hard enough to knock the air out of him. Dewey Thompson climbed down from the top turret to help, starting a tourniquet before Swartout waved him off. At that point, 2 engines were out, and a fuel tank had been pierced. Oil from a damaged cooler line sprayed back onto the belly and coated the ball turret, rendering it a blind spot. Soon, another hit put the top turret out of action. The bomber could barely hold 140 miles per hour, and if they pushed it any faster, the damaged tail began to vibrate so hard it threatened to tear itself apart. To make matters worse, control cables to the number 4 engine were shredded, along with other systems the crew depended on. The intercom had gone out, and with holes in the cockpit, the rushing air was so loud that speech barely carried. Swartout ripped off his headset, looked at Loro, and motioned that he was taking the controls. In the back, the crew began getting ready to bail out, but Swartout ordered them to hold. He told them to give him time to try to fly the bomber home. Swartout wasn't just fighting for a machine. He was fighting for the name on the nose. Letting that bomber fall into German hands meant more than losing an airframe. The Germans were known to use captured B-17s to slip toward American formations and turn the confusion into mayhem by shooting or ramming fighters into the stream. Swartout didn't want their own bomber, let alone King's name, to be used against their own people. Using skills learned from flying fighters, he worked the crippled bomber through shallow dives and slips, spoiling head-on attacks by inches. Oxygen bottles were passed hand to hand in the back. He threaded the King below flak bursts, then slid it up alongside the 390th Bomb Group, weaving along their flank to stay clear of attackers. Most of the other crews couldn't tell what they were looking at. A beat-up B-17, flying crooked, made some of them think of a trap. The odds of it being a captured bomber used as bait were low, but nobody wanted to gamble on low odds up there. One gunner got on the radio and warned the formation anyway. The reply was simple: keep an eye on it. As if it were responding, a battered P-38 Lightning slid into position off Nelson King's wing. Its presence acted as a shield against the Luftwaffe and a clear signal to the Americans that this bomber was one of theirs. The Lightning stayed close until the danger eased, then slipped away. What happened to it afterward was lost in the return traffic. What few guns still worked on Nelson King stayed pointed into the wind. The bomber was barely holding together, with controls heavy, systems failing, and the tail shuddering every time the pilots touched the yoke. They waited for the next head-on pass, the one that would finish it. Then, out of the gray, friendly fighters showed up. Some P-47s and P-51s slid into position. The crew felt the sense that someone was finally between them and their imminent demise. With them, the bomber limped back across the water and made England, with only 2 minor wounds aboard. Even if Thorpe Abbotts received the survivors, it didn't feel like a homecoming. Men climbed out and scanned the line for aircraft that weren't there. Out of their 21-plane squadron, 11 did not return. Some survivors stayed quiet and disappeared into the barracks. Others drank harder than usual. Nelson King didn't even get to land there. The bomber was so shot through, the controllers diverted it to Honington, where it had to be rebuilt. Jack Swartout received the Silver Star for bringing the ship home. That night, Riesemer wrote to his parents and set it straight, quote, "They about got us today. The closest we ever came to not coming back. We went to Berlin. No wonder." In May, a new crew took over Nelson King, this time led by pilot Lieutenant E.L.J. Stewart. On the 24th, Nelson King was shot down near Wittstock, Germany. 3 airmen lost their lives, while 7 became prisoners. The bomber that had made it home once against the odds didn't make it home the second time.